Well, thank you for having me, albeit virtually, as part of this outstanding conference on crisis management in the Howard government. My part of the discussion today is going to be focusing on the terrorism crisis. And I noticed the conference organizers added the subtitle of cozying up to the Americans. I'm going to add a question mark after that, because what I'm going to suggest is that despite a certain surface appearance of cozying up to the US, actually one of the most important features of the Howard government policy during the war on terrorism was carefully limiting and calibrating Australia's commitment to the alliance. So I want to talk about three things. Firstly, the outbreak of the war on terrorism and how it shaped the Howard government's strategic framing of the conflict. Secondly, what I would describe as the three layers of Australian engagement with the terrorism threat after 9/11. At the top layer, the global commitment, primarily in Afghanistan and Iraq during this period. Secondly, the regional cooperation effort with Indonesia and other like-minded partners. And then thirdly, at the local level, the domestic deterrence and response to the terrorism threat. So I'll talk about those three levels, and then I'd like to wrap up with a few brief observations. So to talk about the outbreak of the war on terrorism, the Prime Minister was famously in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. And as we know, he was there to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Ansett Treaty, to meet the new US President, George W. Bush, to discuss the Australia-US Free Trade Agreement and a number of other bilateral issues. And Prime Minister Howard had held extensive talks on the 10th of September, including a 4-hour meeting at the White House with the new president. He'd attended an Ansett ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard and then retired to his hotel in Washington, D.C. And he later described the day in an ABC interview with Richard Feidler as, quote, the last day of the old order, which I think many who watched the attacks unfold on 9/11 would agree with. The morning of 9/11, Prime Minister Howard was at his hotel getting ready to speak with reporters about the collapse of Ansett Airlines, when it was reported that the aircraft had hit the World Trade Center in New York. He was partway through his press conference expressing solidarity with the United States after that attack, when an aircraft hit the nearby Pentagon. And it was immediately obvious that the US was at war and was going to respond accordingly. Prime Minister Howard and his team went straight to the embassy to confer on Australia's reaction. On arrival back in Australia, John Howard invoked the Ansett Treaty for the first time in its exactly 50-year history and offered military support to the United States. And in his speech to the Australian people announcing that, he framed 9/11 as an act of war, as an attack on the US, and through the United States as an attack on all of us, and pledged Australian support. Quickly, with bipartisan support, we should remember, the government initiated Operation Slipper, our deployment to the war on terrorism, embedded planners in US headquarters in Tampa and Washington, D.C., deployed the Special Air Service Regiment and supporting elements to Afghanistan, and took part in the invasion of Afghanistan when it began in October of 2001. Now, Clausewitz famously wrote that the supreme, the most far-reaching act of judgment that the statesman and the commander have to make is rightly to establish the kind of war on which they're embarking, neither mistaking it nor trying to turn it into something that is alien to its nature. Unsurprisingly, because of the circumstances that I've just outlined, Australia's response was framed in terms of alliance commitment. Our aim was to demonstrate our reliability and competence as an ally, and thereby to cement the ANZUS relationship, which both major parties and indeed the bulk of the Australian people regarded and still regard as the cornerstone of our national security. That framing had both positive and negative consequences, as we'll see. So I mentioned that I was going to talk about the three-layered response. So let's start at the global level. So that alliance framing very much drove the top layer, the global layer of our response to the war on terrorism. In Afghanistan, we initially deployed special operations forces for the initial invasion. We then disengaged from post-invasion occupation tasks, but then recommitted in 2006 under the International Security Assistance Force. But we deployed into a distinct, well-defined Australian area of responsibility with specific separate national tasks. So thereby drawing a boundary around the level of commitment that we were making to the conflict. In Iraq, we followed a very similar pattern. The initial deployment in the beginning of 2003 was special operations heavy. We participated in the initial invasion and defeat of Saddam Hussein. We then disengaged, but recommitted in 2007 under separate coalition stabilization mission tasks. But again, we had a distinct Australian area of responsibility with separate specific tasks. So framing the commitment in terms of alliance support meant that we weren't trying to win either of those wars. And it also meant that we calibrated our level of commitment and therefore our loss rate and our level of casualties and our level of expenditure accordingly. That didn't always go down well with the United States or with other allies, particularly the British. And there were times during the campaign in Iraq, in particular, when the British were taking enormous hits in the city of Basra, not that far from the Australian deployment in Al-Batana province, and were commenting unfavorably on how cleverly Australia had played things so that we were seen as a reliable ally and yet weren't being sucked into the enormous battles that were going on in Baghdad or in Basra at that time. I'd also argue that it put a significant burden on Special Operations Command and a sequence of SOTGs, Special Operations Task Groups, while telegraphing a certain lack of political confidence in the rest of the Australian Defence Force, something that had negative consequences for Special Forces morale, but also for the broader morale of the ADF. But I think at the grand strategic level, the results were overwhelmingly positive. It allowed Australia to retain strategic freedom of action. We still had the ability to respond independently to regional issues, including the Ramsey mission in the Solomon Islands, the response to the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami across the Asia Pacific, the East Timor crisis of 2006. So despite the sort of superficial appearance that we were all in with the Americans as a sort of loyal lapdog of the coalition, in fact, we were very carefully calibrating our level of commitment while retaining the ability to respond to crises closer to home. And of course, that also allowed us to respond to the regional challenge of terrorism in the Asia Pacific and within Australia, which became very apparent only a short time after 9/11. So to look at the regional layer, in October of 2002, the Bali bombing brought home the immediacy of that regional threat. More Australians were killed and injured as a proportion of our population in Bali than Americans were killed on 9/11. It was an enormously significant attack on Australia. And one of the key strategic responses in terms of the way that the Howard government framed the reaction to that bombing was to launch a collaborative effort with Indonesia, notably resulting in the Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation, a series of international and regional counterterrorism cooperation conferences in Bali and in Jakarta, cooperation between the Australian Federal Police and the intelligence community with Indonesian counterparts, and essentially Australia taking joint regional leadership along with like-minded countries. Now, it seems sort of obvious that you would frame it in that way, but it wasn't immediately apparent that that was the best way to frame the environment right after the Bali bombing. Australia had been involved in a very acrimonious East Timor intervention only a couple of years before. Our relationship with the Indonesian government was on fairly delicate grounds at that point. And although Indonesia was clearly going through a genuine transition to democracy, it took a certain level of, for want of a better term, statesmanship to decide to approach that incident as an attack on both Australia and Indonesia rather than as an Indonesian failure to protect Australians. And that became the cornerstone, that collaborative effort became the cornerstone of the Howard government's National Counterterrorism White Paper in 2004, and it shaped the ongoing efforts across the region in terms of counterterrorism since that time. The dividends paid by that approach were immediately obvious in 2005 after the second Bali bombing, when the Indonesian police responded much more rapidly and much more effectively than they had to the first bombing, in part as a result of that strong collaborative and cooperative assistance effort that Australia had been engaged in for the preceding 2.5 years. I would argue that actually the partnership really came into its own only well after the end of the Howard government, when it became the basis for the regional response to JI resurgence and the emergence of the Islamic State and the creation of an Islamic State wilayat or province in Southeast Asia after 2015. So that regional layer adds a level of complexity to the government's response. It wasn't a blind commitment to the United States, but rather a carefully calibrated global engagement paired with regional response along with like-minded partners. This is even clearer at the domestic level, that third layer of the response, in terms of domestic border security, policing, internal security efforts. We saw a number of very major muscle moves under the Howard government. One, the transformation of a series of disparate government agencies into the border force, ultimately into the Department of Home Affairs as we have it now, something that didn't come to fruition until after the end of the Howard government, but was very clearly put in motion shortly after 9/11. We saw in Operation Pene, the longest running, most comprehensive Australian domestic counterterrorism investigation involving ASIO, the Australian Federal Police, and the Victorian and New South Wales Police, which disrupted two very major self-organised terrorist cells in 2004 and 2005 in Sydney and Melbourne. We saw the establishment of the Tactical Assault Group East as part of the raising of a regular army commando capability in the form of the 2nd Commando Regiment, giving Australia if you like, a bi-coastal counter-terrorism response capability for the first time. And alongside that, actually arising from the Sydney Olympics more than from 9/11, but accelerating after the beginning of the war on terrorism, we saw the emergence of a domestic chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear explosive capability in the Special Operations Engineer Regiment. One of the more contentious elements of the domestic response was in terms of government anti-terrorism powers, amendments to the Crimes Act 1914, and then the passage of the federal anti-terrorism legislation in 2005. One of the more contentious and more major elements of the second or the final Howard government term. There were and are legitimate concerns over civil liberties, over coercive questioning and detention, but notably, subsequent governments haven't substantially altered the approach. And it seems to have a degree of both bipartisan political support and public acceptance fairly widely across the Australian community. So despite that rather acrimonious political debate at times, the direction set by the Howard government on domestic anti-terrorism and homeland security has endured through governments of both parties right up until today. So some observations. Obviously enough, 9/11 marked the most important national security and foreign policy crisis in Australia in a generation. The Howard government had an experienced national security team already in office through multiple crises before 9/11. The personal commitment from the Prime Minister through just the accident of John Howard happening to be in Washington, D.C. on 9/11 set the tone for the overall reaction and allowed for a very rapid response to the crisis. Inevitably, for the same reason, because John Howard was there in Washington, the issue, and of course there for the Ansett commemoration, the issue was framed as one of ANZUS commitment and being a reliable and competent ally. The alliance relationship was central to Australia's calculus in the war on terrorism, not as a so-called deputy sheriff, which was a phrase unfortunately used by George W. Bush sometime after 9/11, but as a global partner with the ability to carry its own weight and to be recognised as such internationally. But as I've mentioned, it was a carefully calibrated level of effort, retaining our freedom of action for other issues, and indeed to the envy of some other coalition partners, particularly the British. That focus on the alliance commitment gave us a very clear and enduring war aim throughout the war on terrorism, selected early and maintained, thereby satisfying the first principle of war, of selection and maintenance of the aim. But on the other hand, it tied us very much to the US strategy in Afghanistan, Iraq, and subsequently to counter the Islamic State. And it invoked a significant risk here, which you might call the risk of ally incompetence. If your war aim is to be a good ally rather than to win the war as such, and if you're tied to a major ally who is setting the strategic direction for that conflict, then the moment you deploy and take part in the invasion or the beginning of a war, by breakfast time on the first day of the war, you've achieved your war aim. Now, all you can do is to stay the course, to be part of that ongoing commitment. You've got what you came for in terms of strategic objectives, a firm demonstration of an alliance commitment. But that hasn't resulted in the winning of the war. So if your ally turns out to be incompetent in figuring out how to terminate the conflict, then you find yourself stuck. You're sort of like the audience clapping at a speech by Joseph Stalin. You don't want to be the first person to stop clapping. The only thing that you could do at that point to lose the strategic benefits you've gained by coming to the party is to leave too early. I would just mention, of course, that this wasn't unique to Australia. In fact, it was true of every coalition player that joined the effort in Afghanistan and Iraq to support the United States from NATO down. So 54 countries in Afghanistan, for example. And I would argue that Australia, because of its careful calibration of commitment, managed better than most to retain our freedom of action. The Howard government's approach to global, regional, and domestic layers of the problem set created the direction for subsequent governments of both parties right up until today, and arguably will be seen as one of the most enduring elements of the legacy of the Howard government. So returning to the title of this particular session, Australia may very well have appeared to be cozying up to the Americans and certainly drew some criticism both internally and globally for that perception. But I've argued that that was a superficial impression only. The reality was multi-layered, was much more nuanced, and at all levels, including the global level, the hallmark of Australia's response under John Howard was careful calibration of support in such a way that we retained our regional and local ability to respond to developments that came up. And arguably that fact, along with support from mainstream Australian public opinion, explains why the direction set by John Howard on that very first morning of 9/11 has endured until today. So with that, unfortunately, I don't have the ability to take questions because I'm pre-recording this from the United States. But thank you once again for allowing me to be part of this conference, and I wish you everybody the best in the remainder of the session.